Well, I'm Erik Stevens from the Haines Public Library. Go ahead and start this presentation here now that we're recording. Thanks, Kate, for setting it up for us. So I'm going to be talking about the Chilkat Valley Storyboard, which is a project that the Haines Public Library did. It started back in 2013 and went for a couple of years, and now we're just kind of maintaining it, and it's been a really great cultural resource for our library to this day, which is amazing. It's been, almost 9 years now, and the storyboard is still running strong. This was all funded by an IMLS grant project, and the name of the project was the goal of the project was "From Preservation Comes Revitalization," and yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of people before we get started here who are no longer at the Haines Library, but they were an integral part of the project. Patty Brown, who was our library director several years ago, and also Jesse Morgan, who was our cultural coordinator. They put in a huge amount of work for this project, so they deserve a lot of credit. And I'm going to go through go through these slides a little quickly. But if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My address is at the bottom of the screen, technology@haineslibrary.org. Okay, so this project was a partnership, and it's really important to acknowledge this because it couldn't have been done any other way. Like I said, it was an IMLS grant project, and we partnered with the Chilkat Indian Association, which is one of our local tribes here in Haines. And it really is important that this was directed by the tribe and a fully equal partnership. So there's the actual name of the grant. It was called Crossing Boundaries Through Communication. So here's our objectives: to bring the region's rich history, cultures, and traditions to life through creation of an interactive mapping interface. And that's what I'm going to talk mostly about, is that mapping interface. Use technology to foster an increased understanding of Tlingit language and history. Offer knowledge and instruction in traditional ways for tribal and community members. And engage community members, encouraging ownership and participation in the storyboard research and related programs. So, this is a lot more than just this interactive mapping interface. It really was equally about engaging community members, getting them involved in the project, and providing a resource for the community that can last for a long time. So we collaborated with several organizations, and here's a list of just some of them: local museums, conservation groups, Fish and Game, the Champaign and Aishik First Nations, which are in the Yukon Territory, our local school districts, and our local tribes. And again, those partnerships were really critical in the success of the project. In terms of community involvement, one of the first things we did was we started installing local art pieces from local artists in the library. And that served to increase awareness of what we were doing as we started the grant, and also to bring some really neat atmosphere and history into the library. And it stimulated all sorts of discussions. So just having these things in the library, this is a giant cedar carved, a giant cedar carving that we had brought in from master carver Wayne Price, who lives here in Haines. And another thing we did was we involved the schools. These are students from the Klukwan School. And we went to Klukwan and we presented to them and we asked them, hey, would you guys be willing, as part of a school project, would you be willing to do some research for us on local place names? And we'll include that content to make a video or gather images or text or oral histories. And we'll include that information on the storyboard. And they were really happy to be involved. It was a fun project all around. Community ownership. So this project, like I said before, was really directed by the tribes and by the elders. they had really the final say on everything, and that's a very important thing. So when we finally unveiled the storyboard, we didn't really have a name for it. We were just calling it the storyboard. And at first we were calling it the Chilkat Valley Storyboard, which is kind of a typical thing to call things in Haines, because we're in the Chilkat River Valley. But we realized pretty quickly that that name doesn't recognize both tribes that live here. We have the Chilkat and the Chilkoot. So the storyboard was renamed as the Lakut Chilkat Storyboard to honor both tribes. And at the unveiling ceremony there, you can see representatives from both tribes unveiling the storyboard. But it all started with some humble beginnings. Once we had received the grant, we just started with focus group meetings. We brought together local experts and elders, and we just kind of talked about some interesting places around the valley and some place names that people knew well. And we started talking about those histories, and we didn't want to include on the storyboard. And those focus groups helped to steer the project as we got off the ground. So here's me presenting at the Klukwan School. The students were a really valuable resource for us. They were able to do a lot of work and enjoy doing it, and get credit for their classes as well. And the content they produced was amazing, like really high quality videos with great transitions and editing and titles and music, and they just had a blast with it. Highly recommend getting students involved. And then we also collaborated with the Champagne and Aishik First Nations, which is our neighboring indigenous community to the north in the Yukon Territory and British Columbia. And they came down to Haines and provided a ton of information about their own oral histories and traditions. And this book here, Stories from Our Country, contained a ton of content that we were able to add to the storyboard as well. So we started with just a random list of names, and we started organizing them and color coding these names and categorizing them based on how often they were mentioned in various histories or elder accounts, and started narrowing it down because there were hundreds and hundreds of known place names in our valley, but we decided we only had room to focus on maybe 30 at the first cut. So we started plotting them on a little paper map that we had thrown together in our conference room, and just putting sticky notes down and taking notes, and the project really grew from there. Of course, we used our local resources that were available at the library. There's a ton of work that had been done before us by scholars, and we really relied on some of these books to help fill out the information and help us sort out, sometimes when you're taking oral histories, you get conflicting stories about places. And so these resources in the library, these published research books and articles, they helped us to sort through that. But in the end, I think our approach was not to rely on the published literature, but more to rely on the accounts of our local elders. And even when things conflicted, when we had two conflicting accounts about one place name, we would include both accounts in our history that we put down on the storyboard. So this is Joe Hotch. He was a really critical elder for us. He provided so many stories. He's just a wealth of knowledge. And I don't have the audio file here that was originally part of this presentation, but he basically talks about how when white people came, they named the places after themselves or after family names, and they took over the local indigenous names that were actually based much more on how a place was used and how a place might be helpful to people. So, a mountain might be called, place where seals gather or something like that. And those names were often overwritten as Europeans came in. So it's just an important resource to acknowledge these names and make sure that they're not lost with history, because they provide so much information about the past and about the land and about the people. So with that kind of preface, I'll go into the technical, the nuts and bolts of the storyboard table itself and the software. There's really two aspects to it. And I guess I'll go back to that slide here because haven't really shown the table yet in this presentation, but that's the storyboard table that we have in the library. And it's a big touchscreen interface that you can have multiple people all interacting with at once. It's capable of seeing and understanding up to 50 different touches at the same time. And usually there's not that many people using it, but you can have 2 or 3 people working together to scroll around the map and read about the local place names. So there's the software side of things, and then there was the content. And I already spoke a little bit about the content, which was a whole different team of people gathering Tlingit language and oral histories and written histories and the cultural importance of these places. And then there was my job, which was really the software side of things. I was working on the user interface to bring all this content together and hopefully do something expandable so that we could add places later. The program was written in C# and XAML, which are relatively good languages for a project like this. We used the Bing Maps API, and it took almost a year of pretty hardcore software developing to make it happen. I wrote about 6,300 lines of code, which is pretty close to a little novel, a novella. So it's quite a lot of work writing the software. And if you're going to outsource, if you wanted to do a similar project and needed to outsource the programming, which I highly recommend, it's a significant project. It can be expensive, so that's something to think about. But it's, of course, it's worth it if you can get a grant to help pay for this software development time. So here's what that code looks like if you're not familiar. What does the software do? Well, it takes 41 geolocated place marks. So each place mark has a latitude, longitude, a Tlingit name, English name, alternate spellings, Americanized versions, and it takes descriptive text for those places and brings all this media content together into one spot to make it easier to access. So we've got 4,600 words of text, 120 photos, 58 videos, 35 audio clips, some interactive games, map overlays, and of course, bibliographic references. And all that data was basically put into a giant Excel spreadsheet that was then put into an XML file. And the program reads in this XML file and populates all this content onto the map. And feel free, like I said, to send me an email if you have any questions about this stuff. I'm happy to help out. So here's what the map looks like on the storyboard. You have your various place marks placed all over the valley. And then when you touch one of the place marks with your finger, it explodes into content, historical photos, and there's a modern photo for each one. And then there's Tlingit name, and if you press the little audio button, it reads an audio version of the Tlingit name, so you can listen to it, and then all sorts of text and videos. And so here's an example of one of the videos that was made by the students at the Klukwan School. They did a really great job. In terms of gathering content, which was, like I said, a whole different team of people who were gathering content while I was working on the programming for the most part. There were historical photos gathered from our local museum. We had written sources to help with the spellings of Tlingit names. But we had challenge with special characters. Tlingit has several special characters, and we had to really include certain font styles to make sure things worked. We had, like I said before, we had translations from written sources, but we also tweaked those to weigh on the input of elders. We really wanted to focus on the elder input and not just the written sources. So for example, this place, Kachwal 2, which the translation in the literature says place with lots of rocks. In Thornton's interviews, when he interviewed elders, I think this was many years ago that he interviewed them, the translation he got was place where the landslide comes down. And you can see those two different translations of one place name are actually quite a bit different. A place with lots of rocks, that could imply just about anything. But place where the landslide comes down, that's a very specific thing to know about that spot. And this is kind of a common example of most of the place names around here. How you translate them and who you have translated makes a big difference. So when things conflicted, we would present those multiple versions together and really let the community do the talking and stimulate as much discussion as possible among the community. So we compiled all this content and put it all into a big Excel spreadsheet. And that kind of gathered it in an organized manner. And that Excel spreadsheet can then be exported to an XML file. And then the software program reads in the XML file and puts it all onto the map dynamically. And that was back in 2013 when I developed this. There are newer, better ways to accomplish this with a database rather than Excel. I've created similar apps since then, and I've done it a slightly different way. I didn't use Excel, just put the content directly into a database, and then the program reads from the database dynamically. But you can do it either way. There's also a companion website, cvstoryboard.org, which has all the same content and a similar map interface that you can scroll around. I encourage you to go visit this website and go check out our Chilkat place names and their histories and names and importance. So here's one of those. Here's Daisanki and the content on that page. So some statistics. The first year of use in the library, which was, I believe, 2013, 2014, we had about 2,600 user sessions on the physical storyboard at the table in the libraries, which is about 8 per day, which is pretty good, I think, for our library. Average out over a whole year, 8 per day is actually quite a lot of use. People opened over 10,000 place marks that year, and the website was a little bit slow, only 312 sessions that year. I think the website most people didn't know about at first as we started promoting it. But here we are over 6 years later. So back in 2020, which was 6 years after we unveiled the storyboard, we were still getting 1,400 user sessions a year, which is about 4 per day. And the website is getting a lot more use now, about 1,700 sessions, 4.5 per day. So locals are still coming to the library and they're opening the content. Maybe it's visitors who are coming through and just want to learn a little bit more about the area. We have river guides we have a lot of river guides in our community who take people on guided tours, and they'll come in to learn about local histories, and they'll include that information on their tours that they're taking visitors and tourists out, and they share this information throughout the community that way. And the website has been really important during COVID times, of course, because you can log on from anywhere, anytime, and get all this access to all this content. So we know students at the school log on to use that. Our local museum relies on it to an extent, and pretty much anyone interested they've got that available to them. But we're really happy to see that there's some staying power to this project, that it wasn't just a 1 or 2 year thing that faded out and people lost interest. Quite the opposite. I think people are still utilizing it as a permanent resource of our library, which is really, really amazing. So here's some feedback we've gotten from the community. Like I said about Chilkat guides, Scott Ramsey said, I go into the library often to use the storyboard, just love spending time on it. This quote from Jeffrey Moskowitz is really neat. He said he was standing over by the magazine rack in the library, and a young child came up and tugged on his leg and said, hey, come look at this. And he pulled him over to see the storyboard. And this kid showed Jeff, he showed him how the storyboard worked, and he opened a place mark and he activated an audio clip. And he just said it showed the power to span generations with the technology. It really draws people in, and it connects children and adults and elders and really everyone in the community in a really neat way. So lastly, but definitely not least, were the culture programs that were a part of this grant. So I talked about gathering content and creating the technology to put the content onto a table and onto a website. But an equally important part of the grant was the cultural programs and the community engagement that we organized to promote the storyboard and also get people involved. So I talked about the unveiling event, which was a big event for our community. We have some of our local artists in town who had brought in just a ton of incredible artwork to put on display. And we had cultural programs about these pieces of art and stimulated all sorts of stuff. We had visitors coming from the First Nations and the Yukon and sharing their histories and songs and stories. We had programs about local foods. This was a hunting panel with various elders and experts from various First Nations communities and local Chilkat communities talking about ways they've used the land for hunting in the past and the current, and how things have changed and evolved over time. That was a really interesting discussion. We had a couple of programs dedicated just to some of these Chilkat place names. One of them, this is Cotwall 2, and yeah, the historical photos from this location and the history of what happened there were fascinating. So that led to local programming in the library as well. And we did field trips. We took people out to these place names, come rain or shine, and really had a great time doing that. We also did this was fun. We brought in the Native Youth Olympics and did local Native Youth Olympics games in the library as well. And had programs with our local master carver, Wayne Price, who I mentioned earlier. He also is working on dugout canoes. And so here's bringing out one of the canoes, and that was actually installed in the library as a temporary art piece as well. They did paddle making workshops and also dancing workshops, and brought together multiple different groups of local dancers from the Chilkat and the Chilkoot. More dugout canoe projects and field trips, spent a lot of time outside, which was really nice. And here are local elders talking about, at the storyboard, going through and sharing information. And it's amazing how much discussion is stimulated around the storyboard, because people can point at a place and say, oh yeah, it used to be over here, or, we used to have another place that's not even on this table that I think should be on there. We got a lot of feedback like that, which was really great, I think. And here's another, just an example of how it draws people in. Children especially really love the table. So that's what I've got for now. I can't thank enough all the different people who helped out, all the organizations and collaborators. You can see our long list of credits from the storyboard here. So many people helped out, and I can't thank them enough. And of course, IMLS making it all possible. And just kind of a closing quote here from Joe Hotch. He described the storyboard as a gift to future generations. And I think that is very accurate. I think that's exactly how the storyboard will be as we go forward into the future. And another note is that, some of the elders that we worked with on this project sadly have passed away. And it kind of makes you realize, years on, it makes you realize how important it is to record some of these stories before they're lost. And we're happy to be a part of that. So thank you. That's all I've got. And please feel free to email me any questions, technology@haineslibrary.org.